Well, hey, everybody. I'm so excited to welcome you to this conversation with Terry Ishee. Terry is a friend of mine. He's a blessing to the church. And we're going to have a conversation today that really spurs out of our heart for what God is doing in the world during this pandemic, but also what God is doing in the church. Terry, if you don't know him, is a part of Forge America. He's one of their directors, and he's also a church consultant. He leads a neighborhood church in South Austin. But he'd be quick to tell you he's a dad, he's a husband, a foster parent, and a movie lover. Welcome, Terry. Glad you're with me today.
Thanks for having me, Ray.
Yeah. So I just want to preface our conversation. There's so much out there right now for churches around COVID-19 about technical things, about, how are we trying to live into this moment as the church. I'm really hopeful that, Terry, our conversation will be useful, not just for this window, but that the things that we're able to kind of reflect on and see because of this pandemic, the things that have been revealed and are being revealed, that these have long-term implications for for who we are as the church and who God is revealing us to be and what God is revealing our future to be as. So one thing I wanted to ask you, I know that you, kind of like me, you have your world. You have 2 feet in two different worlds. One of them is in the church world. I grew up in the church. I know your story is a little different than mine, but I do a lot of work with pastors in traditional settings. I do a lot of work uh, with lay people in churches and trying to help churches see outside of their walls. But then I have this part of my life that is totally outside the church, that includes some kind of missionary leaders, but it also just includes what God is doing with people who aren't church people. I know you have that too. Have you noticed a difference in the way people are experiencing COVID-19 in those two different worlds for you, the church world and the world that's outside the church? And if there are differences or not, just talk a little bit about that part of your world in this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think there has been significant difference in that. I think there is some similarities. I mean, this is uncharted territory for everyone, So whether you are in that church world or the unchurched world, there's a lot of despair and a lot of unknowns, and so those things. And so I always want to preface and show grace to that. Even our brothers and sisters who are leading large congregations and trying to figure this out, and their hopes and desires to try to figure out how to sustain during all of this is difficult, and I want to be sensitive to that. But it's funny. One of the things that I noticed quite a bit, especially in my neighborhood, is how, as this thing goes on longer and longer, there are so many people who are so desperate just to connect, and really be good neighbors.
Mhm.
It's funny. I've been doing I've got a couple goals that I've set up for my own mental health during all this. Just otherwise, I'm going to lose it.
Yep.
And so one of those is to walk a mile a day in my neighborhood. So just pick a route and just walk in my neighborhood for a mile. And I was doing this the other day, and as I was walking, I saw, and I'm not the fastest walker, and I've got podcasts on, or usually I'm doing a phone call. And if I'm doing a phone call, I've got to go to pace where I'm not breathing heavy. So
Right.
it's like, so I'm not just like, so I can actually be tolerable on the phone. And so I'm walking down the street, and I have this mom who's got a baby on her hip. She's holding like this 5 gallon like jug. I'm like, and I'm trying to figure out what it is. She's got two kids in tow behind her, walking down the street, and
Impressive.
then I realized she's got like this giant jug of sangria. She's walking to a neighbor's house. And
Yeah.
so by the time I make it over there, and it's right down, it's like 3 houses down from me, and I see them, and they're all just set up on the driveway, and they're like having this impromptu happy hour. And what is funny is I know all the people in this driveway except this mom who obviously brought the party to the party. And one of the things that just kind of hit me as I was talking to a neighbor is like, how did you guys get connected? And I understand how Heather and Lizzie, they're across the street from one another. That makes sense. But how did this other mother get connected? And it's one of those things where they didn't know each other before this happened. Like, these are relationships forged in this pandemic, in this kind of neighborhood crisis where we can't get out and go connect. And so, because they all have children roughly the same age, they're finding ways to connect with people that they didn't yet know. And it's, what's funny is, just yesterday they had two different gatherings. They had a Sunday morning gathering over at her house, which is 2 blocks over. And then we saw that, and I was like, oh, look, they've moved the party. That's awesome. And then me and my daughter went and ran some errands for the middle school that she's out. We're putting appreciation signs in our neighbors' yards. And so by the time we come back, they moved back to the PM gathering over at Lizzie's house. And so, and that's just one of many of these types of gatherings that we're seeing in the neighborhood, where people are just forging new relationships with people that are literally next door. I mean, when I see it, I see the kingdom of God blooming in my
Yeah,
neighborhood, and they don't even realize it, that they are living out this idea of love your neighbor and love your neighbor well, being generous towards one another. Um, and when you look at next door, or if your neighborhood has a Facebook group, that's where the complaining tends to
sure.
be. But like in the streets, you're
Yeah,
seeing neighbors cross, their
yeah,
boundaries, their fences, and they're being good neighbors to one another. Um, Unfortunately, I'm not necessarily seeing the church do that. The church has been very innovative, and the church has done, I would say, a fairly good job of gathering its people in this
mhm,
time, which I understand early on is a challenge. And again, I don't want to like seem that we're beating them down. We get that the church should gather, but I don't think they've done enough to go beyond that. That they're offering a lot of opportunities for the church to come together online and these sorts of things. But I think when we look back at this time, I'm afraid we're going to look back and see this as a huge missed
mm,
opportunity, a missed opportunity to really kind of connect with those literal neighbors that we have. That if we look back and we look at the church and say, hey, our church we're a small church, we have 150, 200 people. That represents, let's say, 10 to 20 neighborhoods. And we missed an opportunity to encourage, equip,
yeah,
prepare, even on the simplest basic level of encouraging our people to do what my neighbors are already doing,
right.
is to simply walk out the door, meet a neighbor, invite them to the driveway, and just have some conversation and build those relationships. Because we know that it's in those relationships that spiritual matters really do evolve and kind of come from. And without those relationships, we rarely see significant interaction with the gospel.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So,
Yeah, one of the things that really motivated me to try to have some conversations with other people was this frustration, and I realized it was an awakening, a grief in me about the church, and that any missed opportunity really isn't about just the moment you miss the opportunity. So it's not just about what we're missing right now in the midst of a pandemic. It's about the lack of preparation or attitude or assumptions that kind of put you in a place where you weren't looking in the right spot and you didn't have your ears tuned to the right noises. And so there's a reason this is a missed opportunity. It's not just an accident.
yeah.
And so I think something that's really struck me is just how ill prepared or unfocused we are on being church where we are. And when I say we, I mean church. I mean church people. And so I'm with you. I'm seeing a natural human drive for connection and this just organic community building. The ice has thawed on a lot of the local relationships that maybe always felt kind of hard to create. It's just easier right now. People are open. They're looking for it. But then in the church, um, we don't feel prepared, ready to, and I would take this on several levels. One is with our kids and families in our homes. So again, if we've always outsourced church to the professionals that are in the building, and then suddenly we don't have the professionals and we can't go to the building, then for a lot of people it's been like, well, how do I do church in my home? Now how am I the church on my street? And so we have a generation of church going Christians that just don't feel prepared. That's been sad to me to think that's why we missed this opportunity. And I think we still are in a window when
Yeah.
there can be this awakening to, wait a minute, no, God is right here. I don't have to leave my home. I don't have to leave my street. God is right here. But how do I get to the place where I can be a participant with what the Holy Spirit is doing in my life? Like, even that notion right there, being a participant with the Holy Spirit in my place, is something that scares a lot of church-going Christians. So anyway, what do you think of all that? And how would you diagnose how we got here? Why is the church missing this opportunity?
Yeah, that's such a fantastic question. There are a couple of things to kind of sock away in the back of our heads to help us think through this. And so one, from a psychological standpoint, when you are faced with a crisis, as a leader, so organizational crisis, whatever it may be, pandemic, whatever, you often only have the bandwidth, the
Mm-hmm.
energy to address programmatic issues. And so everything that we're discussing so far are not programmatic issues for 90% of churches. Churches already are designed to do what they're already doing, in a sense that Sunday gathering, caring for the congregation. So a lot of what churches are already designed to do are to care, stimulate, educate existing congregations. There are a handful of churches in the West that are designed to kind of equip and connect people to be mobilized to have these types of relationships, to use your words, to participate with God and the Spirit in the mission field. And so when crisis hits, we what we're seeing, this opportunity is not a programmatic opportunity, which the church often reacts with, right?
Right.
Something happens
That's how we
and
solve problems. Yeah.
the church will react with a felt need message series, because the program is an actual halfway decent strategy to connect with people. This is not a crisis that a program can actually affect. This is something that is uh, more of a different paradigm. And so when we have paradigmatic type issues like this, we can only address those when the program is at ease, when we
Mm-hmm.
feel comfortable that
Mm-hmm.
we can set that aside and think different lens and different things. And so how do we set that down so we can now have the conversation? How do we prepare? How do we equip our people to be missionaries in their everyday life, that people can know that they can participate in the mission of God, not Sunday morning through their church, but they can participate in the mission of God in their everyday life, Monday through Saturday, just by simply being a good neighbor, being a good friend, listening to their neighborhood, listening to their people, learning the stories and those sorts of things. And so because churches haven't, sorry if you can hear the lawnmower neighbor is just kicked up. Um, um, these paradigm shifting ideas, they get lost. And so if a church isn't already thinking that before the crisis
Right.
hits, there's no chance that they're going to,
In
there's very
crisis.
little chance that they're going to be able to pivot that far to address those sorts of things, so that their people, the congregation, can be properly equipped for mission. And here's the thing that is a bit sad, a bit frustrating, is our people don't require a ton of equipping to do these
Right.
sorts of things.
They already know how to do
They
some
already
stuff.
know how to do it. a lot of it is license,
Mhm.
a little bit of language, um, and letting them know that, hey, that's okay. That's in bounds. That's
Mhm.
you have permission to do those sorts of things. Because I'm looking at my neighbors who no one's given them permission, but they're naturally doing these things because they don't have the restraints or whatever it is that may be pulling believers, churchgoers, to be a part of these sorts of things. And so
Right.
I think that's where we're at. And so I don't necessarily think it's a today problem. I think it's a yesterday
Yes,
problem
exactly.
that has led over to this. And so
So
we go ahead.
yeah, so I'm interested in how we might be able, if this is a yesterday problem, and could this moment be yet another, because there's others, opportunity for the church to think differently about this programmatic. And one of the ways that I was talking on another interview is about the kind of planning and control mechanisms that we operate through programs. And let me try to, for those listening, like, try to put some flesh on this. If weekend worship and events in small groups at your church have been the centerpiece of what church is, and keeping those things going takes all the energy, and then there's a pandemic or a crisis that hits, then suddenly everything becomes, how do I shift now digitally, or how do I shift to keep those things up, going? And what you were saying was, a lot of churches have, when things are going well with the programmatic stuff, have a little bit more resource, energy, money, staff, time to start exploring kind of the missional things, or the things outside the walls, the alternative ways of living that people really know how to do, but the church doesn't put emphasis on. And so crisis hits, and suddenly all that energy is back there. And what's happening now is reopening of Texas, at least in our context, is I feel like it's ratcheted up another notch. It went from, how do we do all this online, to now, how do we keep everything, all of our programs and events going, with following the rules for reopening. Um, and so that's just me trying to give a little more specificity, because we use language, because we talk about this stuff all the time, that some people are like, what are those guys talking about? But yeah, what I have found, though, and I don't know about the pastors that, in my system, in the Methodist Church, I would say most of the pastors, that colleagues that I talk to, I'm friends with, they know things need to change.
Yeah.
They knew things needed to change, and what I want to get to is there the whole institutional programmatic focus. I don't even think necessarily is what pastors and leaders of churches really want. It's just what they feel like they have to do.
Yeah.
So what would you say to congregational leaders, pastors, and not people who aren't pastors, staff, lay people in churches, who say, we know that we need to get in the mission field. We know that we need to empower and equip people on the ground in the world, but we just feel like we can't get underneath, get past this inertia. And this an opportunity, and how could we live into the next year and really um, start joining God in the world? How could we do that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that it's important, and I would just encourage anyone listening, don't hear what we're not saying. We're not saying that Sunday's bad. We're not saying that gathering and small groups and those things are bad. Those are good things and worthy of attention, resources, and all of that. But I think what we are saying, and what we would encourage congregational leaders to think through, is those are baskets that we cannot afford. And today, and the times that we're dealing with, are evident on that.
Yes.
They're baskets that we cannot put all of our eggs into. And so I come from a Baptist heritage. And so I appreciate the grace of letting a brother from another
We got
denomination on.
plenty of grace over here, buddy.
Yeah, man, I love it. And so, one of the things that the Baptists, they hang their hat on, that they love them some disaster relief. And
Mm.
so they at the state level, even at the national level, they create these giant disaster relief teams, and they're impressive. I mean, they are, like, you look online, any major not even just in Texas, but anywhere in the country, there's a major catastrophe. There's Texas Baptist men. And it's always funny. It's always men, right? Like women can't be a part, but that's a different podcast.
All right.
But it's this idea that we've created this thing where we can mobilize the people. And the thing that, and it's a good thing. And again, I'm not saying that's bad, but it's telling to how we think when we organize the church, because we want to almost outsource those sorts of things. So one of the things that I've always been fascinated with in this country, in our history, is the 1920s, the teens, right before the Great Depression, and then into the 30s. And really, what did, and I'm not a political guy by any means, but this some reason fascinates me, is our government's role and the church's role in society during those times, where if you were to go back 1800, so the 19th century, America, and early 20th century, those first 20 to 30 years in America, there were no parachurch organizations. If
Right.
there were needs that needed to be addressed, the church in of itself addressed it. The
Local
church would rally, the local church would rally, step in and provide. Because the church at that time, more than today, they didn't have it perfected, but more than today, they operated more from a balanced approach to leadership. They had equal prophetic giftings, where someone would say, man, the poor in our street, that's wrong. We should do something to address that. And so that was in the local church. So you had that system for that. When we had no true welfare system, because the church provided all of those sorts of things at the local level. And then when FDR, when everything kind of fell apart, it was in that moment that the government said, we have to step in.
Right.
The church either isn't capable or wasn't willing to a degree that was satisfactory to provide these sorts of things. And in that moment, and there are a lot of things that go into this.
Sure.
And so I'm not saying this is a one thing, but
Sure.
this is part of it. In that moment, the government took on the role of shepherding and caring to some degree. And then
Social welfare. Yeah.
Social welfare. And I think it was in that was the beginning, where you now fast forward the next 50 to 70 years. So by the time you get to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the church could operate successfully. And when we say successfully, we mean attendance, financial support to maintain and sustain, building buildings, kind of expansion, and those sorts of things. By the 70s roll around, 50s to the 70s, you have this success that could happen without the prophetic, the evangelistic, and really without the apostolic giftings in the church, because you could solely rely and be successful on the idea that if we taught the scriptures really well and we cared for the congregation itself, we didn't have to care for the city, but if we cared for the people who sat in the seats, you could grow a church really, really well.
Right. It worked for decades.
And so for the most part, 90% of churches have that same thinking. You know, most churches today are designed to achieve what we were trying to achieve in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so when you have an issue like this come up, the church is often ill-prepared to be mobilized, you know? And so that's where you have now these denominational level where they're saying, we need to have something. So rather than equipping the local church to be mobilized, we now mobilize these parachurch organizations like the Texas Baptist Men, Salvation Army.
As Methodists, we have lots of ways that we do this in connection with big organizations. Yeah.
Yeah, and Samaritan's Purse, all these different types of organizations, World Vision, that are doing great things, but they're led by apostolic prophetic leaders. And so the church is missing that. And so we often, the church typically, are ill-prepared to equip our people to do just the everyday mission work, just the everyday love your neighbor, love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength, and to love your neighbor just as well. It sounds so simple when we preach it and when we say it, even as congregants, if we say it, oh, I love God and love my neighbor, I can do that. But when we begin the process of actually loving our neighbor, for some reason, I don't know what it is, but we go blind. We like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what my next first step is. But yet our neighbor on the other side who's not
Right.
church, who
I
isn't a
think,
part of a congregation, doesn't have that command in their life, but they just naturally do it.
and I think part of it, what we've been saying, is that there's something that this voice comes into our head when we are invited by the Spirit into relationships, into loving our neighbors and doing things that it's back to the permission thing. And we say to
Yep.
ourselves, wait a minute, I have not been taught or trained to do this. I know in my church, people get trained to do this, and I'm not. So I don't want to do something that's outside of my jurisdiction as a Christian. And there's also just this the passivity of being a part of a church. And I want to make sure I'm gentle here, because the passivity is also a loving submission to the authority of the church for a
Yeah.
lot of people, to come into the church and to sit and listen to what is spoken and do our best to live it in our lives, and then let the programs and ministries be either driven by the local church level, or like you said, by these kind of church organizations, or denominational level groups. Yeah, we've worked that way. This moment that has kind of shut down that whole mechanism, to me, just so clearly is a moment where God is saying, I'm not saying I'm going to get rid of all of these great organizations or leadership in the church, but this is such a moment for the grassroots, neighborhood-based, family-based experience of God in the home and in the neighborhood to be put on again, and to be practiced again. And for me, you're kind of talking about it from a mission side, and I think some people will hear what you're saying and go, yeah, the mission is really important to the church. We're not getting out there enough. All of that, I think everything you're saying is true, but it is not separate from the discipleship conversation.
Yeah, that's
Because
absolutely
I think
correct.
where my passion really, and I'm learning this over this last year, I care so much about the mission piece, but what really breaks my heart at its core is that everyday church Christians often don't get to live into the discipleship Christ offers, because we can only find that when we're living our faith in the world, and when we're living our faith in relationship with our neighbors. And so that's mission, but that is discipleship. That's where we encounter and learn how to follow the Spirit of God on a daily basis and hear the voice of Jesus leading us into the world. That's where we learn what is messed up in us. That's where we have to face our shadow, and it's where we get healed. That's where salvation continues to happen in our life. And we would call all that mission. And that it's kind of like, why are we surprised when you go on a mission trip and you come back and go, I got more out of that than I gave? That's because discipleship and mission never were meant to be siloed committees in our churches. The transformation of the world and the transformation of our own hearts and lives by the power of Jesus, I mean, those go together. So I love what you're saying.
Yeah, I think it goes back to how we organize the church. Um, because I agree 100% that discipleship and mission are so intrinsically intertwined. I think and even you can throw evangelism. So if there's
Yeah.
anyone listening saying, well, what about evangelism? When I look at mission, and really the mission of God is this idea of, the church doesn't have a mission. Mission has a church, right? I love that's kind of New Begin and David Bosch. Those are kind of things that those guys really champion. This idea that the church, we don't have a mission. It's God's mission that we get to participate in, and not just the paid staff or the clergy, but everybody, every follower of Jesus gets to participate in this mission. And so when we look at mission, I often will tell people mission is simply a coin, and the two sides of the coin are discipleship and evangelism. And so you cannot do mission without discipleship and evangelism. It's naturally overflow of what that is. And so when we commit to do discipleship, we have to be mindful, is our discipleship engaging and overlapping into the mission of God?
Right.
Because there are a lot of churches that will begin they will begin the initiative of discipleship, and it never scratches the level of what the mission of God is. And so one of the things that as leaders, congregational leaders, organizational leaders, we have to ask ourselves is, what's the organizing principle that we are really having the church come around? And so I would say majority of churches in America, they would look at worship as the organizing principle of the church, where they would say everything we do in a worship experience, that's what our primary focus is.
Right.
And so everything flows out of that. But when we do that, we know that community isn't as strong because it's more passive. It's more kind of come and see, kind of check it out. You have some people who are step into it, but not at a large number. And then you'll see some churches that, you know, they'll have a heavy influence of the Reformation, or maybe they've got some of that prophetic gifting, so they rise up and say, no, we need to be really, really purveyors of the truth. And so maybe they'll be bent on discipleship, and so we're going to be really heavy theologically, so we're going to disciple our people to have really strong theology, and so they'll orient around discipleship, and then everything else, so worship and community and mission, almost seem a little diminished. But when we look at mission and we say, okay, if we're really going to take this idea of mission seriously, if we can begin to use that as the lens of as the organizing principle, to now look at how does mission inform how we worship,
Right.
how we disciple, and how we engage in community, will it actually make it better or will it hurt it? Well, I'm a believer, and this is what I've basically given my life for the last decade, and probably what I'll give my life for the next 2 decades, is I believe that if we use mission as the organizing principle, we're going to have better worship, we're going to have better community, and we're going to have far better discipleship than if we were to simply look at worship first, knowing that worship in of itself does not lead to very robust discipleship, mission, or community.
Right.
And so I think that's where we have to wrestle. And again, that's where it's a yesterday problem. And so if we haven't wrestled with it yesterday, it's going to be hard to address today's issues.
Yeah, just let me give an example of what I think you're saying. And I've seen a couple of examples of this following pastors and leaders on Twitter. But if we were to take mission as the organizing principle, that kind of is the lens by which we try to determine what we do as the church and how we do it. And then we take worship, because that's the first thing a lot of people think of as church. Here's a thing I've really thought a lot about. If we, in this moment, were to have said to ourselves as the church, okay, we are in a pandemic, we can't do large gatherings, we can do some online stuff, but what if we could equip our people to be worship leaders, preachers, musicians, singers, teachers in their homes and in small groups in their neighborhoods? That is mission, is what gets you to think that way. Mission is what gets you to say, instead of putting our most trained professional in front of a camera now so that people can all tune in and watch our trained musicians and all this stuff, what if instead we let mission really drive this, and we said, yeah, why don't we train more preachers? Why don't we, so that we can meet different kind of people, different kind of ears? What if we instead of saying we need this really good kind of music, said, if anybody can do anything, maybe you play the harmonica, maybe you don't think you have a singing voice, maybe you don't think you can lead worship in your home with your kids, or, I mean, I just have been dreaming that this would be a moment when more and more people in the body of Christ get permission and are equipped to just take that issue of worship, but then you could extend it to discipleship, to children's ministry, to outreach and mercy ministry to the people in need. And again, instead of centralizing that in the way that we do now with organizing principles, saying, no, mission's going to break this whole thing open so that we can meet a more diverse people, and we can meet more people at a local level where people really experience it and are blessed by it. Is that an example, the way I was kind of saying that, of what it would be if we let mission drive worship and mission drive discipleship?
Yeah, it's one of those things where it has to happen at the organizational level where leaders are asking themselves, how am I letting the mission of God influence those realms? And I think the first step is you have to have a good definition of what the mission of God is. I'm a big fan of David Bosch, who's a South African missiologist who's no longer with us. He passed away several years ago. And he defines the mission of God as uh, it's not so much the recruiting of or converting people to God, but it's simply an alerting of the rule and reign of God through the life of Jesus. So the mission of God, his whole mission is to alert people to his glory, to alert people to his reign. And it's in that response that people are driven to their knees to the lordship of Jesus. And so the church, if we rally around this mission of alerting people to the rule and reign of God through Jesus, we have to ask ourselves, how does our children's ministry, which would probably fall under discipleship, or how does our worship ministry, which is our Sunday morning experience, how are we alerting people to the rule and reign of God? So how are we doing that in our neighborhood? So all of those sorts of things. And so we have to ask that at a
Right.
leadership level. And then the output is exactly what you're saying. If we have done the hard work of that, where we're equipping people to think this way, to take this on, to see themselves as missionaries, you're going to see that very thing where people are going to begin to live out those examples that you shared, where they're engaging in what I would say everyday mission.
Right.
They're engaging in the everyday mission of God.
Yeah. I want to bring up money because right now the pinch for a lot of churches is economic.
Yeah.
There's a lot of concern that, I mean, right now giving has gone down. Unless your church was just totally positioned for online giving. In my tradition, a lot of churches were way behind with that and are suffering. And a lot of them were already on the bubble. And then we're talking about fallout, right? Maybe the next 6 months, maybe the next 2 years, maybe foreseeable future, there's going to be, the rich aren't going to have as much money, disposable income that they give to churches and nonprofits, et cetera. Why is it so important? And this is just the facts, right? Like, I think some of what's going to drive the church to think differently about its organizing principle and drive the decision to do church differently is going to be, we can't afford to do it the way we've done it. Do you think that there's truth to that? And do you think, if there are pastors that are saying, I'm worried about this year being able to afford the model, right, the way we've done it,
Yeah.
what good news can you give them about, well, if you're willing to do things differently, it could cost less and actually empower our people and empower the mission of God through the church?
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And I do think that's where we're headed. One of I have several roles that I get to give leadership to in my life. One of those roles is I'm a church planting catalyst for a network of churches. And so I've been involved in the church planting world for the last really almost my entire adult life. I helped plant a church uh, in Cedar Park, Leander, 23 years ago, 24 years ago, and it's doing very, very well these days. And so I've planted a church. I've coached hundreds of church planters over the years in this, and so I've seen the trends in church planting and how where we are at today with church planting is so different than where we were 5 years ago and definitely 10 to 15 years ago.
And where we're going to be tomorrow?
And where we're going to be tomorrow is even going to be crazier. And 20 years ago, when we planted Life Church, we had, I mean, there was so much money out there. It was like, hey, we want you to plant this one church. We're going to give you this. Here's how you go do it. And that's what you did. And then fast forward a decade later, and I'm planting my church at that time, the one that I'm continuing to still lead. And I was like, well, the money's not quite there, so you have to have more partners. And so you have to kind of broaden who you bring in to be at that table. And then now fast forward to today, where I've got church plants that they've got 20, 25 organizations who are all chipping in to do this. And And the reason why isn't oh, we want to have a wide variety of voices to help us and support, which that's the good thing. The problem
Sure.
is that no one organization can drop how much money it costs. Well, I mean, we know the average church plant for the last 20 years to be effective. And when we say effective, it goes back to people in the seats,
Sure.
money in the plate.
Viable in the traditional model.
That's right. The average cost to plant a church like that in the last 20 years has been anywhere from $250 to $550,000 a year. That's what it costs to plant a church. And so the ability for a church to do that by themselves is almost near gone. We're talking maybe 1% of churches in the West that can do that. And what they're realizing is we can just do a campus for a fraction of that cost and
Right.
keep all the autonomy and keep all the, keep everything almost kind of like keep it in. So church planting has been affected by the finances. And now we know that there are a large amount of churches that are closing their doors every day. And it's not because their heart for Jesus is diminishing. No. It's not because the congregation is turning away or rebelling or sinning. It's simply because the finances to run the church the way that we know how to lead the church, people aren't able to keep up with that because it is just too expensive. And so that's why we are seeing churches be sold and turned into coffee shops and libraries and co-working spaces, bars, all sorts of different things. And it's because the finances. And so we have to get really serious about putting energy and effort towards what does it look like to create expressions of the church for $0. And so one of the things that an organization that I also get to work with, Forge America, that's one of the things that we're shooting for. We're trying to figure out how we can work with churches to help them plant and start expressions of the church that cost $0. That it doesn't require the purchase of a building. It doesn't require the purchase of 4 or 5 staff members to run something, but simply planting a church, an expression of the church, extending the church where it's $0, or as close as we can get to $0. And so that's the innovation, that's the entrepreneurial spirit of America that we have to tap into. And I think the problem and the reason for the delay in this, because we look at every other sector in our country and we see the innovation, we see the entrepreneurial spirit, but it's lacking in the church. And I think the primary reason is because it's going back to what I was talking about earlier. We've pushed the apostolic leaders, those entrepreneurial leaders, the ones that have those, I got a crazy idea, it just may work. Those sorts of leaders, we've kind of pushed out of the congregations, and they've put their energy and time into nonprofits that are doing amazing kingdom work.
Right.
But when it's come to the church, we just haven't had enough of that type of energy. And I know there are some great people out there, good friends, good organizations who are wrestling with that and have been wrestling with that for the last handful of years. And so I love those guys, appreciate their work. But again, it's so few and far between. We're still so far behind. So we have to put energy towards that. How are we addressing those things? Because it is possible, because we're seeing some great reports of what that looks like.
Yeah, I think the pinch is there now. I think it's going to increase. Of course, you're going to have a small slice of very successful churches that are mega churches. We've seen that trend, right? That mega churches grow while the overall church declines.
Yeah.
And so churches in the middle and churches that are smaller are going to feel this. And I'll pitch my own ministry that, I'm trying to figure out even myself how to become more bivocational and find other ways to bring income for my own family. But to empower a layperson to start a book club in their neighborhood does not cost anything to the quote unquote church. It costs something to that layperson. It costs something to the people who bring the potluck food and buy the books. But that's a deferred or a dispersed cost in the hearts of the people doing, and those things can become church. They can become a new way of doing church. So our neighborhood ministry, throwing parties in the neighborhood where everyone pitches in for the burgers, can cost $0 and be a seed for communities of faith.
Right.
And I think it feels like a risk to a lot of churches to take a major investment of staff
Hmm.
and a little bit of startup money, maybe, to say we really need to start doing some missional stuff that's on the ground. But really, we don't have a choice. This is where God is moving, but it's also where we have to go because we can't afford to do the model that we've been doing.
Yeah.
So
I
uh,
I think something that's helpful to address some of that, even thinking through that. So if there's someone out there, denominational leader, pastor, who's like, you know what, how do I even begin thinking that way? One of the things that's helpful is to begin to wrestle with an understanding of how institutions work. I don't think anyone would argue that the church in America, the church in the West, isn't an institution. I mean, it is truly
yeah,
an institution. And when we look at institutions and how they're created, we know that every institution was birthed out of a movement, and so every healthy movement becomes an institution. Now, the things that make a movement healthy will not automatically make an institution healthy. And I
right.
think that's where we miss it. Because I
Yeah,
think when we see churches and we see the institutions, both at the macro level and the micro level, especially the micro level, because I know a lot of pastors who are like, we're not an institution. We're not an institution. I was like, bro, you're 15 years old and you're plateaued. You're an institution. Like, I mean, you've made it. And so, but you're fighting it. Because they're trying to think, the things that got them started, the things that made them the early movement healthy, will not make an institution healthy. And so the thing that we have to understand is healthy movements lead to healthy institutions, and healthy institutions, which require a different sort of leadership, a
right,
different paradigm, will lead to healthy new movements.
right,
And so the problem that we're seeing in the West is you see churches that are institutionalized, and they are missing the opportunity to become healthy in a way that starts new movements. And so I think that's where, and so again, I'm not saying we get rid of churches. I think we have to pivot how churches exist. And so I know some great church leaders that are large churches that I'm having conversations with, and they're beginning to wrestle with and think through. God has blessed them for sure, and God
right,
is using them in a mighty way. But what would it look like for them to now turn on the institution, turn on the machine, that they can begin producing new movements, that new expressions of the church, where we now know those expressions have to cost $0.
right.
That's the key. And so I think that's what I'm excited about looking into the future. And because I don't think this is a this versus us versus them
No,
sort of conversation. It very much it's an all of us. We have to, as the whole church, both those who are institutionalized, large organizational churches, and those who are trying to do the macro, micro thing, where they're gathering, but then really sending and mobilizing their people. It's gonna require all of it for us to really make the impact that we want to see a movement happen here in the West. And so I'm hopeful, but right now we definitely have to address some things if we're
yeah,
going to get there.
yeah. I'm hopeful as well. And it's important to, I know you know this and say this, that the institutional church is one piece of the emerging movement
Yeah.
that God is leading the church in. And again, it's both and that there are going to be people for another generation that are going to want to do church in the traditional model, but it's going to also include secular partnerships with businesses, and it's going to have people who aren't Christians who believe in the work that the movement of the church is doing, who are willing to invest themselves into it. So it's a lot of things, which is beautiful and really hopeful.
Yeah.
Terry, I'm so grateful, man, for the time that we've had on this call, and I want to make sure people know how to learn more from you and find you. So can you just share a little bit about where people can get connected to you? You've mentioned a couple of ways that might happen. If people want to know more, where do they go?
Yeah. At a national level, the easiest way is forgeamerica.com. I serve as the director of church partnerships and training. And so Terry, Terry, at forgeamerica.com. And so that's the easiest way just to reach out. At a local level, Neighborhood Church Collective, nccaustin.com is a way to connect with me there. Or just ask Ray. Ray has my information.
I'll find it. It's not easy, but I can track them down.
That's right.
Hey, I know you were about to say something. Is there anything else you want to share with anybody who
No,
might be listening to this?
it's funny. I think I love the idea of just being clever. I think just being innovative and clever is so smart, especially as we move forward. And in both at the large level, so the macro and the micro level, we have to give God's people permission to just try some crazy things and not hold this expectation that you're going to mess it up. And I think that's the number one reason why God's people in the West, at least, are apprehensive about engaging mission. Is they're like, what about if I mess it up? What about if I do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing? And so there are beautiful examples, both at a small level where I'm seeing neighbors who are trying to navigate, all the different things that are out there that we say, don't do that, but they're navigating it and engaging culture, engaging people, and it's beautiful. And then even at an organizational level, I was chatting with a guy, and there's a church in Michigan, and I want to say it's Kalamazoo. It's because it's been years since I've even thought about this, but you'd said secular business partnerships. And there's a church in, I believe it's Kalamazoo, that they owned a building. And they took in kind of the downtown area. So it was an old church, historical church. And they took a corner of their building, which sat on the corner. So they were like a corner piece in the city. And they turned it into a Subway. The church opened up a Subway sandwich shop.
Yeah.
And that Subway actually produces all the income it needs to run the building. And so now the church, their big thing is, what do we do? We don't need tithes and offerings to make this thing go because Subway is taking care of it now. So what do we do when people give? And so now, instead of the church looking at their people as you're the resource to make this go, they now is like, well, you're just a resource, but what are you a resource for? And it's pushing them to think mission. How do they make a greater impact in the city? Because they're not seeing, and again, this is a crude way, and I know it's not intentional. This is so subconsciously, we often as leaders, because we're trying to sustain organizations, that we all often look at our people as a financial resource, that without the people, we can't move on. And so we've got a church in Seattle that's doing the same thing. They bought a 3-story office building, and in the bottom floor, they opened a co-working space. They have children's space and offices on the second floor, and their worship spaces on the third floor. And their co-working space on the bottom floor pays for everything. And so everything that they do, tithes and offerings as a church, they're pushing it back into the city of Seattle and impacting and doing all sorts of mercy ministry, equipping and mobilizing their people for mission. And so it's these innovative things where we just have to be willing to say, can we do this? Why not? Let's just try it and see, because I think it's that type of spirit that's going to lead us into this next phase of ministry.
Yeah, we are in an experimental research and development age of the church right now. And if we can, the sooner we accept that and are willing to invest in that and know that it's holy and God is with us in that way, the more fun we'll have.
That's right.
And the less stressful it'll be.
That's the key.
And trusting that God's got the church.
That's right.
We may go through a season where it feels like decline and uncertainty and risking and failing. But if that's faithful, if we're doing that faithfully, we do not need to worry.
That's right.
God has got us.
That's a great word, Ray.
Well, Terry, thank you so much for your time. I would love to hook back around in several months, just because I know the world is still going to be different even then than it is now. And I love talking about the church with people. I could do it all day. So thanks for your insight. Prayers for you, your family, your ministry, all that God has called you to. May you just continue to be blessed and be faithful in your work. And I'll catch you again on the other side, man. Take care.